You are a senior member of the British royal family. You were born into one of the most privileged positions on earth. You have spent your entire adult life surrounded by deference, by people who address you correctly, who stand when you enter a room, who speak to you with careful, measured respect, because that is what the role demands, and because the institution that surrounds you has always enforced it. And then one day, somebody stops deferring, not in the subtle way that gradual institutional distancing works. Not in the careful language of managed statements and strategic silence, but directly, loudly, in a moment that strips away every layer of protection that title and privilege have always provided and leaves you standing in the exposure of what someone who actually worked with you really thinks of you. The accounts emerging from people who have worked with, protected, and served Prince Andrew over the course of decades paint a picture so consistent, so specific, and so damning that they cannot be dismissed as isolated grievances or individual personality clashes. These are not tabloid rumors. These are documented accounts from a royal press secretary who served the Queen for over a decade, from the man who commanded 450 officers responsible for royal protection throughout the 1990s. From parliamentary figures who used language in a public forum that would be considered extraordinary when applied to any member of the royal family, and what all of them say across different roles, different decades, different contexts, amounts to the same thing. The behaviour was real, the entitlement was documented. And the people who experienced it have not forgotten it and are no longer staying quiet about it. Today we are going to go through everything. The caravan warning that revealed just how far the institutional tolerance has collapsed, the specific accounts from specific named individuals who worked closest to Andrew and describe what that was like in terms that pull no punches. The parliamentary denunciation that brought the private pattern into the public record, the Royal Lodge history that shows this is not a new situation, but the latest chapter in something that goes back decades. And the central question that all of it leads to, has anything actually changed? Or is the same pattern continuing in a smaller house under tighter scrutiny with fewer people willing to absorb the consequences of it, where he is and how he got there? Before we get to the accounts and the warnings and the pattern, let us establish exactly where Prince Andrew is right now and what the path to this point looked like, because the context is everything. Andrew has left Royal Lodge in Windsor, the 30-bedroom property with its historic associations and its sprawling grounds, the address that maintained the visual grammar of royal importance long after every other marker of that importance had been stripped away, is behind him. He fought to stay there, he delayed his departure. He pushed back against the institutional pressure to vacate in ways that cost him goodwill he could not afford to spend. He is now based at Sandringham. Specifically, temporarily at Wood Farm while his intended long-term residence, Marsh Farm, was made ready. And Sandringham is worth understanding properly because it is not simply a country house. It is a 31-square-mile estate. Think of a space the size of a substantial city. Farms, woodlands, villages, schools, a museum, and as it turns out, a caravan park. A fully managed, tightly controlled royal environment where every element is under institutional oversight. This is where Andrew now lives, not by choice. By the progressive removal of every alternative. Marsh Farm, the property designated as his long-term base within this environment, required substantial work before it could be considered suitable for occupation. Not cosmetic work, not the kind of light refresh that makes a perfectly habitable property feel fresher and more personalized. Fundamental work, complete rewiring. Extensive plastering, concerns about asbestos that had to be investigated and addressed before anything else could proceed safely. King Charles is privately funding this arrangement. That fact is essential to understanding everything that follows. Andrew is not independently financing his own housing situation. He is dependent on his brother's private generosity for the roof over his head. Every pound spent on Marsh Farm is a pound that Charles has chosen to provide, and every additional demand made on top of what was already agreed is a demand being made on that same private generosity. That is the financial and relational context within which Andrew reportedly kept pushing for more, the demands that broke the patience. The baseline situation, a major renovation project on a property requiring fundamental safety work, privately funded by a brother whose patience was already being tested by years of managed embarrassment, was difficult enough. What reportedly happened on top of that baseline is what moved this from a difficult situation into a confrontation. The curtains transporting from Royal Lodge, where they were designed and fitted for windows of a specific size and proportion, to Marsh Farm, where the windows are different. And not simply moved but altered, expensively altered to fit the new property. The cost of this alteration, for curtains that could have been replaced for a fraction of the total expense, was reportedly considerable enough to register as a specific grievance. Then the artworks. Valuable pieces moved from Royal Lodge to Marsh Farm, some of them, according to reports, so large that they did not actually fit on the walls of the more modest property they were being transporting to. Objects acquired in an environment of unlimited space, now being forced into rooms that cannot accommodate them properly. The removal company handling this transition was Gander and White. Not a general removal company, a specialist firm that handles high-value items requiring particular care and insurance. Their reported charge for a single team was around £15,000. Individually, each of these details might be manageable. A single extravagance in an otherwise reasonable process, but taken together, they describe something specific. An attempt to replicate the scale and character of Royal Lodge inside a property that is fundamentally different in scale and character, not an acceptance of changed circumstances, but a resistance to them. An insistence that the new situation conform to the expectations formed in the old one. Charles's response to this, as reported by multiple outlets, was anger. Genuine frustration, a refusal to pay for anything beyond what had already been agreed, and a clear message that the goodwill underwriting this arrangement was not unlimited. And then came the additional element that pushed things to the point of the warning. Andrew was reportedly delaying his full departure from Wood Farm, staying beyond what was agreed, because Marsh Farm had not yet met his standards. While Charles needed Wood Farm available for other estate guests, the deliberate hold on a property he was using as leverage, while his brother needed that property freed up, was the act that produced the most direct and specific message Andrew has received about his current situation. You could end up sleeping in a staff caravan, the caravan that changed the conversation. Let us be precise about what the caravan warning actually represents. It is not a practical threat in the sense that anyone genuinely intends to put Andrew in a staff caravan and leave him there. What it is a communication, delivered through the channels that the palace uses when it wants something understood clearly, but without the accountability of a formal statement. The message being communicated is the removal of the assumption that has always operated underneath Andrew's sense of his own position. The assumption that regardless of what happens, regardless of how many demands are made, regardless of how people around him are treated, there will always be a floor of royal provision beneath him that reflects his birth and his family connection. The caravan warning says that floor is lower than he thinks, that within the structure of the Sandringham estate, within the 31 square miles that includes farms and woodlands and a caravan park, there exists accommodation that is not royal accommodation in any meaningful sense. And that the gap between where Andrew is now and that accommodation is determined not by his birth, but by his behaviour. This is a fundamentally different message from anything Andrew has received before. Throughout the years of scandal and managed distancing and institutional removal, the flaw was always there. The assumption of provision was always there. The sense that the bloodline itself carried a guarantee was always there. The caravan warning removes that guarantee. Or at least tells him clearly that the guarantee has conditions that he is currently at risk of failing to meet. That is why the warning has generated such attention, even among people who understand that it is unlikely to be literally executed. It is not about the caravan, it is about what the caravan represents. The possibility, stated explicitly and with apparent seriousness, that the flaw Andrew thought was permanent is actually contingent. Dicky arbiter, and what a decade of observation reveals. Now we come to the accounts that give the current situation its full weight. because the caravan warning and the renovation demands would be a relatively contained story without the context that former palace insiders provide. Dickie Arbiter served as the Queen's Royal Press Secretary for over a decade. This is not a peripheral role. The press secretary to the monarch occupies a position of genuine significance within the palace communications structure. They work closely with the senior royals over extended periods. They observe the gap between the public image and the private reality from a position of genuine proximity. Arbiter has spoken with warmth about King Charles. He describes him as a good employer, someone known for working tirelessly, often deep into the night, driven by genuine commitment to his role. He has shared a specifically warm memory of Princess Diana, who thoughtfully organized a 50th birthday celebration for him, a personal gesture that he clearly found genuinely touching, and that speaks to Diana's awareness of the people around her. When Andrew comes up, the tone changes, not subtly. Dramatically, Arbiter stated directly that palace communication staff would likely be relieved that they no longer had to account for what he described as Andrew's arrogant and entitled behaviour. Let that phrase sit for a moment. A man who spent over a decade embedded in the palace communications structure, who has spoken warmly about virtually every other senior royal he worked with, using the words arrogant and entitled to describe Andrew. And framing it in terms of relief. The staff who had to manage communications around Andrew are relieved he is no longer a prominent figure requiring that management. That is not the testimony of someone who had a personal falling out or who harbors a specific grudge. That is the assessment of a professional who observed a consistent pattern across years of working within the same institution. DYDAVIS and the protection officer's account. If Dickie Arbiter's account comes from the communications side of the palace, Di Davis brings a completely different professional perspective that arrives at a remarkably similar conclusion. Davis oversaw royal protection throughout the 1990s. He was responsible for roughly 450 officers whose job was the physical safety of the senior royals. This is not a ceremonial role. It is operational, demanding, conducted in close proximity to the people being protected, and it requires a clear and direct understanding of who those people actually are when the public performance is set aside. Davis speaks positively about his experience working with most of the royal family. Charles is described as polite. Diana is recalled with warmth. The general picture he paints of the senior royals he served is favorable. Andrew is the exception. Davis recalled a specific exchange that captures something essential about the dynamic. In a security-related interaction, Andrew dismissed the person he was dealing with and demanded to speak to someone more senior. Davis was the most senior person present. He told Andrew this. Andrew was informed that the person he was dismissing and demanding to escalate beyond was in fact the person in charge. Davis's assessment of Andrew following his professional experience working with him was blunt and specific. He described Andrew as boorish and ignorant. These are not gentle words. Boorish means rough, bad-mannered, unrefined in a way that is actively unpleasant to be around. Ignorant in this context does not mean uninformed, it means deliberately dismissive. Contemptuous of the people and the expertise around him. Coming from a man who spent years protecting Andrew's life, who managed the officers responsible for keeping him safe, who worked with him in situations of genuine pressure and genuine consequence, the words boorish and ignorant carry a weight that no tabloid characterization could match. This is what the people closest to Andrew professionally and practically actually experienced, not the image. The reality, Colin Burgess, and the direct confrontation. The accounts from Arbiter and Davis establish a pattern. The account from Colin Burgess, another former royal aide, adds a specific incident that makes that pattern concrete and impossible to abstract into general character criticism. Burgess described an interaction with Andrew in which Andrew pointed at an object and issued a direct, unadorned command: "You wrap that." Not a request, not an explanation of what he needed and why. A command delivered to a person whose professional role involved far more than wrapping objects on demand. delivered with the kind of casual authority that assumes the person being addressed has no response available to them other than compliance. Burgess's reaction, as he described it, was fury. He found the treatment ignorant and undeniably rude, not because he expected elaborate courtesy or formal appreciation, but because the basic human acknowledgement that the person you are speaking to is a person rather than a function you can direct without the normal conventions of interaction was simply absent. The incident is small in scale. Nobody was hurt. Nothing of consequence happened as a result of it. But that is exactly why it matters. Because what it reveals is not the behavior of someone under pressure or in a difficult moment. It is the behavior of someone operating from a settled assumption about the relationship between themselves and the people around them. An assumption so deep and so unquestioned that it does not even register the impact it has. You wrap that. 3 words that contain an entire orientation toward the world. When Parliament speaks. The pattern documented by former palace insiders was not confined to private accounts and insider testimony. It entered the public record in the most formal way available in British public life. In Parliament, Trade Minister Chris Bryant addressed the question of Andrew's conduct in terms that would be considered extraordinary in any context, let alone when applied to a member of the royal family. Bryant did not hedge. He did not use the careful diplomatic language that political figures typically deploy when discussing royalty. He labelled Andrew publicly in Parliament as a rude, arrogant and entitled man. Consider what it takes for a sitting trade minister to use those specific words in that specific forum about a member of the royal family. Parliament is not a tabloid. It is not an entertainment programme or a social media platform. It is the most formal public arena in British political life. Words used there carry a different weight and a different kind of permanence than words used almost anywhere else. For a minister to stand in Parliament and describe a senior royal as rude, arrogant, and entitled is an act that requires a level of certainty and conviction that goes beyond personal opinion. It reflects a broader institutional assessment that has reached a point where the normal conventions protecting royal figures from direct parliamentary criticism no longer apply. The words used by Bryant were identical in substance to the words used by Arbiter and Davis and Burgess. Arrogant, entitled, rude, dismissive. The same pattern, described by different people in different roles in different contexts, using language so consistent it could have come from a single document. It did not come from a single document. It came from lived experience. Repeated. Documented. Consistent across years and roles and interactions. Why this moment is different from all the others. Everything described so far, the accounts, the parliamentary language, the staff testimony, has existed in the public domain for some time. The individual pieces have been available. So why does the current situation feel different? Why does the caravan warning feel like something new rather than just more of the same? Because the context has changed in ways that change the meaning of everything within it. When Andrew was a prominent working royal, when he had official duties and institutional standing, and the full infrastructure of royal protection and staff and public role, the behaviour described by Arbiter and Davis and Burgess was managed. It was contained. It was absorbed by the institutional structure around him because the institutional structure had both the capacity and the reason to absorb it. He is no longer a prominent working royal. He has no official duties. His institutional standing has been removed. The infrastructure that once managed the consequences of his behavior no longer exists in the same form or with the same commitment. What remains is a private arrangement, funded by a brother who is simultaneously the reigning monarch of an institution that has been working for years to establish distance from Andrew and everything associated with him. An arrangement that is maintained by goodwill that is documented to be wearing thin. Under conditions that leave no buffer between Andrew's behavior and its direct impact on the people around him. In that context, the same behavior that was once absorbed without visible consequence now has nowhere to go except directly into the awareness and the frustration of the people experiencing it. Charles is angry about the renovation costs. The staff are dealing with demands and treatment that former palace insiders have been describing in consistent terms for decades. And the goodwill that was once freely available is now rationed and clearly running out. The caravan warning is different from what came before, not because the behavior is different. The behavior appears to be exactly the same. It is different because the institution around the behavior no longer has the capacity or the inclination to absorb it. The Royal Lodge that tells the whole story. One detail from the Royal Lodge period deserves examination because it illuminates the entire arc of this story in a way that nothing else quite manages. The lease on Royal Lodge, taken on in 2003, ran for 75 years. The terms involved obligations of over £8 million in repair and maintenance responsibilities, plus a notional annual rent of £260,000. A 75-year lease. Taken on at a moment when Andrew's position felt permanent and his occupancy of that property felt like it would be the settled, long-term reality of his life. The kind of commitment that reflects an assumption of continuity. An assumption that the circumstances of 2003 would remain the circumstances of 2023 and beyond. They did not remain those circumstances. The world shifted. The institution shifted. The calculations around who Andrew is and what he represents to the monarchy shifted in ways that 2003 could not have predicted. And yet the lease existed. The commitments existed. The expectations built around that property existed. This is the central dynamic of Andrew's situation, expressed in concrete terms. The commitments and expectations formed in one version of his life are colliding with the reality of a completely different version. The curtains designed for Royal Lodge do not fit Marsh Farm. The artworks acquired for 30 rooms do not fit 5. The assumptions about what is owed and what should be provided that formed across decades of one kind of life do not fit the circumstances of a fundamentally different kind of life. That collision is producing the friction that is now generating warnings. And the warnings are producing the accounts and the stories and the parliamentary statements that are collectively making clear that the pattern is what it has always been. He has been warned. Directly. In language that admits of no ambiguity. In terms that strip away every protective layer of institutional courtesy and state plainly that the floor beneath him is lower than he appears to understand. A staff caravan. On the grounds of the same estate where he now lives. Within the 31 square miles of Sandringham that contains farms and woodlands and villages and yes, a caravan park. The most undignified possible address available within the physical boundaries of his current world. And the warning that it is closer than he thinks. The people who worked with him across decades have spoken. The press secretary who found warmth for almost every other royal used the words arrogant and entitled. The protection commander who found most royals pleasant used the words boorish and ignorant. The aide given a 3-word command used the word furious. And a trade minister standing in Parliament used all of the above. None of these people are in conversation with each other. None of them coordinated their testimony. They simply described their individual experiences of the same person across different years and different roles, and arrived at descriptions so consistent they sound like they came from the same source. That consistency is the most damning thing about all of it. Because inconsistency allows for context and circumstance and the complexity of individual situations. Consistency across decades and roles and contexts suggests something more fundamental. Something embedded. Something that the circumstances of a person's life have reinforced so thoroughly for so long that the removal of those circumstances does not automatically remove the patterns they created. The question that everyone who has followed this story is now asking is the one that has always been at the heart of it. Has anything actually changed? The renovation demands suggest the answer is no. The curtains suggest the answer is no. The oversized artworks in undersized rooms suggest the answer is no. The reports of how staff are being treated suggest the answer is no. The caravan warning suggests that the institution has reached the same conclusion. And that this time, unlike all the times before when the pattern was managed and absorbed and contained, the consequences of the answer being no will be allowed to land. Whether they do is the question that only the next chapter of this story will answer. But the warning has been issued. The goodwill is running out. The floor is lower than he thinks. And the people who have spent their careers watching this pattern repeat itself are no longer